In the spring of 1943, the air war over Europe reached a crisis point that no amount of industrial output could immediately fix. The United States Army Air Forces possessed hundreds of heavy bombers, each capable of carrying thousands of pounds of explosives across the English Channel. Day after day, formations of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators lifted from airfields in East Anglia and climbed into the grey skies toward occupied Europe. Their contrails drew long, perfect lines across the horizon, symbols of an industrial nation's determination to crush Nazi Germany by destroying its factories, railroads, and oil supplies from above. Yet behind this display of power lay a fatal weakness. Once the bombers crossed deep into enemy territory, their escorts had to turn back. The fighters that had risen to protect them, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, lacked the range to reach the heart of Germany. When they left, the sky turned hostile. German radar stations detected the formations long before they reached their targets. Squadrons of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s climbed to meet them, diving through the bomber streams again and again. Each attack tore open aluminum hulls, scattering debris and bodies across the cold air. Crews counted losses not in planes, but in dozens of men per mission. The 8th Air Force, newly established in England, watched its casualty reports grow longer with every operation. American doctrine demanded precision daylight bombing, but daylight also meant visibility, and visibility meant death. At the same time, in factories and design offices thousands of miles away, engineers were struggling with another paradox. North American aviation had built a sleek, fast fighter named the P-51 Mustang. Originally designed for the Royal Air Force in 1940, it had shown remarkable speed and efficiency at low altitudes. Its laminar flow wing and clean aerodynamic lines promised exceptional performance. But the Allison B-1710 engine that powered it simply could not breathe at the altitudes where bombers flew. Above 15,000 feet, the Mustang lost its edge, gasping for power in the thin air. It was a thoroughbred built for the wrong race. The aircraft's potential was visible in wind tunnel data and flight tests, yet it remained a tool without a mission, a design waiting for the right heart. That heart appeared not in an American workshop but in British hands. Engineers at Rolls-Royce had spent years perfecting the Merlin engine, the same power plant that kept the Spitfire and Hurricane alive through the Battle of Britain. In 1942, Ronald Harker, a Rolls-Royce test pilot, flew an Allison-powered Mustang and immediately recognized what others had missed. The airframe was superb, only the engine held it back. His report, sent through official channels, reached both Rolls-Royce management and the Ministry of Aircraft Production. Within months, experimental work began at the company's facility in Hucknall to mate the Merlin to the Mustang fuselage. It was a technical marriage across nations, a British engine fitted to an American body, carried out not by dreamers but by engineers who trusted numbers more than intuition. By the time the first Mustang X flew in October 1942, the war had already proven that survival in the air depended on range, speed, and altitude. The test results were electrifying. With the Merlin installed, the Mustang's performance transformed, its climb rate doubled, its top speed increased by nearly 100 miles per hour, and it could fight effectively at 30,000 feet. Yet these figures, though extraordinary, remained buried in reports and memoranda for months. In Washington and London, officials hesitated. Production schedules were already strained, and re-engineering an aircraft during wartime seemed reckless. Few realized that this hybrid machine could be the solution to the problem that was bleeding the 8th Air Force. In the spring of 1943, as bomber losses reached unsustainable levels, the need for a long-range escort became urgent. Strategic planners feared that morale among aircrews would collapse before Germany's factories did. Every mission to Schweinfurt, Regensburg, or Bremen demanded sacrifices that could not continue indefinitely. In this atmosphere of desperation, the experimental Merlin-powered Mustang began to draw attention. It was lighter and more aerodynamic than the Thunderbolt, faster than the Lightning, and capable of carrying external fuel tanks that promised to extend its reach deep into Europe. No one at that moment could predict that this aircraft, dismissed as an Anglo-American curiosity only a year earlier, would soon become the defining fighter of the Second World War. The decision to unite a British engine with an American airframe did not come from a single stroke of genius or defiance of authority, but from collaboration, persistence, and a willingness to cross institutional boundaries. It was an act of engineering diplomacy in an age of total war. And it began, quietly, in the spring of 1943, when a problem of endurance met a solution born from two nations' shared determination to regain control of the sky. By 1943, the Allied air war over Europe had reached a deadly equilibrium. The United States had committed itself to a doctrine of daylight precision bombing, a bold, almost idealistic strategy that sought to cripple Germany's industrial heart through targeted strikes rather than indiscriminate destruction. The idea was simple in theory: destroy the enemy's factories, railways, and refineries, and the war machine would grind to a halt. But the practice was brutal. Each raid into German airspace meant sending hundreds of bombers across hundreds of miles of hostile sky, and once they crossed the Rhine, they entered a battlefield entirely dominated by the Luftwaffe. The 8th Air Force, based in England, carried the burden of this mission. Its B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators represented the might of American industry, mass-produced giants of aluminum and steel, bristling with defensive guns and flown by young men barely out of training. They lifted off from airfields across East Anglia in the cold dawn, formed into tight box formations, and set course for targets in France, the Low Countries, and eventually Germany itself. Each mission was planned with mathematical precision, each route calculated to maximize the effect of their bomb loads. But the mathematics of survival told another story. The bombers could defend themselves only as long as they stayed together. The idea of mutual protection, through overlapping fields of machine gun fire, had worked against sporadic attacks, but by 1943, German tactics had evolved. Fighter controllers guided waves of Bf-109s and Fw-190s directly into the bomber formations. They attacked from head-on, where defensive fire was weakest, or from above, diving through the formation and climbing away before gunners could react. The Luftwaffe had also developed specialized weapons, rockets, heavy cannons, even air-to-air mortars, designed specifically to tear apart dense bomber groups. The American Escort fighters, though powerful, simply could not stay with the bombers for the entire mission. The P-47 Thunderbolt, rugged and fast, had a range of barely 350 miles without auxiliary tanks. It could escort the formations only across the Channel and a portion of occupied France before fuel calculations forced it to turn back. The twin-engine P-38 Lightning, with greater range, faced other problems in Europe: unreliable engines in cold, high-altitude conditions, and maintenance difficulties far from its Pacific supply chain. Once the escorts left, the bombers were alone for the most dangerous portion of the flight, the final approach to the target, and the long journey home. The results were catastrophic. On the 17th of August 1943, during the famous Schweinfurt, Regensburg raid, 376 bombers took off, 60 were shot down before returning to base, and over 500 airmen were killed or captured in a single day. The following October, another attack on Schweinfurt cost 60 more bombers, nearly 600 men, and forced commanders to suspend deep penetration missions into Germany. For every 100 bombers dispatched, at least 20 never came back. Those that did often limped home riddled with bullet holes, engines on fire, landing gear frozen, and crews broken by exhaustion and fear. Inside the airfields of the 8th Air Force, the mood grew grim. Hangars filled with the twisted remains of aircraft that had once been the pride of their squadrons. Each returning crew spoke of the same nightmare: waves of German fighters attacking with relentless precision, while the sky around them turned into a storm of tracers and burning fuel. Intelligence officers calculated that if losses continued at the same rate, the 8th Air Force would cease to exist within a few months. The crisis exposed a fundamental flaw in Allied strategy. The United States had built its air doctrine on the belief that heavily armed bombers could fight their way to the target and back without fighter support. That belief had been shattered by experience. Armor plating and machine guns were no match for speed and altitude. The Luftwaffe's advantage in range and coordination meant that every American formation was a predictable, slow-moving target. The promise of precision bombing now depended entirely on whether someone could provide an escort capable of flying as far as the bombers themselves. Commanders and engineers both understood that the solution was not more bombers, but a new kind of fighter. It had to climb high enough to engage interceptors at 30,000 feet, stay aloft for 6 or 7 hours, and still have the agility to dogfight when the enemy appeared. It was a list of requirements that seemed almost contradictory. Long range usually meant heavy fuel loads, and heavy fuel loads meant less maneuverability. The technology to combine both had not yet been tested in combat. By the spring of 1943, the pressure to solve this problem had become unbearable. The American strategy of daylight bombing was collapsing under its own logic. Without a long-range escort fighter, the 8th Air Force could not survive. Without the 8th Air Force, the Allied campaign to destroy Germany's industrial capacity would stall. Every delay meant more empty bunks in the barracks, more names on casualty lists, and more shattered aircraft lying in English fields. The war in the air had become a war of endurance, and the United States was running out of time to find an aircraft that could fly farther than death itself. The origins of the Mustang lay not in an American request, but in a moment of British urgency. In April 1940, with the Luftwaffe preparing for an assault on Western Europe, the British Purchasing Commission arrived in the United States in search of fighters. Their primary goal had been to secure more Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, but Curtiss-Wright's production lines were already committed. The representatives approached North American Aviation, a relatively young company known for its trainers and the B-25 Mitchell medium bomber, and asked if they could build the P-40 under license. North American's President James H. Dutch Kindleberger believed his engineers could do better. He promised to design and deliver a completely new aircraft in the same time it would take to start licensed production of the Curtiss model. The British agreed, signing a contract on April 23, 1940 for 320 aircraft to be built according to Royal Air Force specifications. The task fell to a German-born designer named Edgar Schmid, who had emigrated to the United States after working for Fokker in the 1920s. Schmid had an instinct for aerodynamic purity and an engineer's obsession with efficiency. His team began work immediately, racing against the clock. From the first sketches in April to the prototype's rollout in September, only 102 days passed. The result was the NA-73X, a low-wing monoplane that looked different from anything else in the sky. It had an all-metal fuselage, inward retracting landing gear, and a revolutionary laminar flow wing that minimized drag at high speeds. The aircraft's smooth surfaces, flush riveting, and narrow airfoil made it one of the most aerodynamically efficient fighters of its generation. The NA-73X first flew on October 26, 1940. Test pilots were impressed by its speed, maneuverability, and range. The prototype achieved over 380 miles per hour at medium altitude, comparable to contemporary fighters, but the Allison V1710 engine revealed its weakness almost immediately. While the engine performed well below 15,000 feet, its single-stage supercharger could not provide sufficient power at high altitudes. Above that ceiling, performance fell sharply. For the Royal Air Force, which needed fighters capable of intercepting bombers at 25,000 feet and higher, the Mustang's engine was a serious limitation. Nevertheless, the aircraft offered advantages that no other Allied fighter possessed in 1941. It could fly faster at low altitudes, carry more fuel, and remain stable during long reconnaissance missions. The British ordered the type into production as the Mustang Mki, equipping Army Cooperation Command for low-level photo reconnaissance and ground attack missions. In this role, the Mustang excelled. Over the fields of France and the Netherlands, its pilots discovered that the aircraft was rugged, fast, and easy to handle. It could outrun German interceptors at low level and deliver accurate fire from its 4 Browning machine guns and 2 20mm cannons. By the time the United States entered the war in December 1941, the Mustang had already proven itself in limited operations. American observers noted its potential and began considering adaptations for their own use. Yet its central flaw remained unsolved. At high altitude, where bomber formations operated, the Allison-powered Mustang was outperformed by every German frontline fighter. The breakthrough came not from official directives but from the curiosity of a test pilot. In the spring of 1942, Ronald Harker of Rolls-Royce flew an Allison Mustang and immediately saw the mismatch between the airframe and the engine. The fuselage was aerodynamically near perfect. It simply lacked the power to reach its full potential. Harker wrote a report recommending that Rolls-Royce install their Merlin 61 engine, the same two-stage, two-speed supercharged power plant used in the Spitfire Mk9, into the Mustang's frame. The suggestion moved quickly through the company's engineering department and found support within the British Ministry of Aircraft Production. At Rolls-Royce's facility in Hucknall, Nottinghamshire, engineers began modifying a small batch of Mustangs for testing. The work required extensive redesign of the engine mounts, cooling system, and carburetor intake. By October 1942, the first of these experimental aircraft, designated Mustang X, was ready. On October 13, 1942, it made its maiden flight, and the results astonished the test crews. The Merlin engine transformed the Mustang's personality. It now climbed like a Spitfire, exceeded 430 miles per hour at altitude, and retained its legendary range. For the first time, a fighter combined long endurance with the speed and ceiling necessary to match the best German interceptors. The trials at Hucknall proved that the idea worked not merely in theory but in practice. Engineers recorded gains in top speed, climb rate, and fuel economy that exceeded expectations. The British shared their findings with American authorities, who immediately saw the strategic value. North American Aviation, already producing Mustangs in California and Texas, began adapting its assembly lines to mount the Packard-built version of the Merlin, designated the V1650, in place of the Allison. The transformation of the Mustang from a low-altitude support aircraft into a high-altitude escort fighter was not the result of a single invention, but of a series of incremental steps born from necessity, cooperation, and technical insight. What began as an emergency order from a desperate ally had evolved, within 2 years, into the foundation of one of the most capable fighters of the Second World War. The journey from the NA-73X prototype in 1940 to the Merlin-powered Mustang X in 1942 was a testament to how war accelerated innovation and how engineers on both sides of the Atlantic could, together, reshape the future of aerial warfare. The success of the British Mustang X trials in late 1942 reached American military circles at a time when the need for a high-altitude, long-range fighter had become desperate. Reports from Rolls-Royce test pilots and engineers described performance figures that seemed almost implausible. The Mustang, previously regarded as a capable but limited low-altitude aircraft, was now climbing to over 30,000 feet and exceeding 430 miles per hour in level flight. The combination of the Merlin's two-stage, two-speed supercharger and the Mustang's efficient airframe produced results that neither nation had achieved independently. What had begun as an experimental British modification quickly drew the attention of the United States Army Air Forces and of North American aviation's leadership. Within weeks, the findings from Hucknall were forwarded to Washington and to the headquarters of the 8th Air Force in England. The Americans immediately saw the potential to solve their escort problem. The Merlin engine was already being manufactured in the United States by the Packard Motor Car Company under license, designated the Packard V1650-3. This meant that production could be scaled rapidly without dependence on British factories. The Air Technical Service Command and the Material Division at Wright Field began consultations with North American to adapt the Mustang for this new power plant. At the company's Inglewood plant in California, Chief Designer Edgar Schmud received the request to re-engineer the airframe for the Packard-built Merlin. It was not a simple substitution. The new engine required a redesigned engine mount, a different carburetor air intake, and a new cooling system to manage the Merlin's higher thermal output. Schmud and his engineering team reshaped the upper cowling to accommodate the intercooler ducting, refined the oil cooler housing, and adjusted the location of the center of gravity. The exhaust stacks were lengthened, the cockpit ventilation improved, and a new four-bladed Hamilton standard constant-speed propeller replaced the three-bladed unit of the earlier versions. The re-engined prototype, designated XP-51B, took to the air in late 1942 for its first test flights in California. The results confirmed what Rolls-Royce had already demonstrated. The aircraft now reached speeds of more than 440 miles per hour and could climb at over 3,000 feet per minute. More importantly, it retained the Mustang's exceptional range, which far exceeded that of any American or British fighter then in service. The Merlin's two-stage supercharger gave it the ability to operate at the altitudes used by the 8th Air Force's bombers, something the Allison-powered models could never do. The United States Army Air Forces, recognizing the potential, issued an initial production order even before the prototype's testing was complete. By early 1943, North America's factories in Inglewood and Dallas were being retooled for mass production of the new variant. The designation P-51B was assigned to aircraft built in California, and P-51C to those from Dallas, though both were mechanically identical. Engineers continued to refine the design, reinforcing the fuselage structure to handle the increased power and torque of the Merlin and enlarging the radiator scoop under the fuselage to improve high-altitude cooling efficiency. Every element of the redesign had to be optimized for wartime production. North American's management worked with Packard to coordinate deliveries of the new engines, while the Air Corps handled logistics for the propellers, armament, and avionics. In less than a year, the first production P-51B rolled out of the factory. The speed of development was extraordinary, from the British prototype's first flight in October 1942 to the first American-built Merlin Mustang in the air by mid-1943. The new fighter was not only faster and higher flying than its predecessors, but also far more versatile. With external drop tanks, it could escort bombers deep into Germany, a mission no other Allied fighter could perform. It retained the Mustang's characteristic stability, long range, and precision handling, yet it now possessed the raw power to compete with the best of the Luftwaffe. Pilots noted its balanced control response, its light touch on the stick, and the smooth thrust of the Packard Merlin at altitude. Behind these technical achievements stood a rare moment of wartime collaboration. The re-engined Mustang embodied the integration of British and American engineering traditions, the finesse of Rolls-Royce design joined with the industrial capacity of the United States. Edgar Schmidt's role as chief designer was crucial. He not only adapted the engine to the airframe but preserved the Mustang's aerodynamic integrity during the transformation. He ensured that the addition of the heavier Merlin did not compromise the aircraft's agility or structural balance. By the time flight trials concluded, the United States Army Air Forces had in its hands the aircraft it had been seeking since the beginning of the bombing campaign. The XP-51B's success became the catalyst for full-scale production, and the first operational units began to form in late 1943. The Mustang, reborn through the marriage of two nations' technologies, was ready to assume its new role, not as a low-level reconnaissance aircraft, but as the long-range guardian that could follow the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. When full-scale production of the Merlin-powered Mustang began in 1943, the transformation from experimental prototype to mass-produced weapon of war unfolded with remarkable speed and precision. North American Aviation's factories in Inglewood, California, and Dallas, Texas, became the twin engines of this effort. Each facility operated around the clock under blackout conditions, filled with the metallic rhythm of wartime manufacturing, the hammering of rivets, the whine of drills, and the hum of conveyors moving unfinished fuselages down the assembly line. Thousands of workers, many of them women newly trained for industrial labor, contributed to the assembly of wings, fuselages, and engines that would soon define air superiority over Europe. The aircraft produced in Inglewood carried the designation P-51B, while those built in Dallas were marked P-51C. The two models were virtually identical, their only differences lying in minor assembly details and serial numbering. Both mounted the Packard V1650-3 Merlin engine, rated at 1,450 horsepower, coupled with a four-bladed Hamilton standard propeller. The airframe retained its elegant lines, but every element had been refined for combat conditions. The fuselage was strengthened to handle greater engine torque, the radiator scoop enlarged for more efficient high-altitude cooling, and the cockpit canopy modified to improve pilot visibility. Testing at Wright Field and at operational training units in Florida and California confirmed the new Mustang's extraordinary range. With internal fuel alone, it could cover more than 950 miles. Fitted with two 75-gallon drop tanks beneath the wings, its range exceeded 1,600 miles, far beyond that of any other Allied fighter. Engineers had not merely improved performance, they had redefined the practical limits of aerial escort. The logistical process behind Mustang production reflected the scale of America's wartime mobilization. Packard's Detroit factory delivered Merlin engines on a precise schedule, crated and labeled for immediate installation. Hamilton Standard in Connecticut supplied propellers, Bendix provided carburetor and ignition systems, and companies across the Midwest produced thousands of components, from hydraulic pumps to oxygen regulators. At Inglewood and Dallas, subassemblies arrived by rail, were inspected under military supervision, and were riveted into place by crews who worked in rotating shifts 24 hours a day. Each completed airframe was rolled out onto the flight line, its polished aluminum skin gleaming under floodlights, before being ferried to testing stations for final acceptance flights. By the autumn of 1943, the first production P-51Bs were being shipped in crates to Great Britain, where they were reassembled at depots operated by the U.S. 8th Air Force. The first units to receive them included the 354th Fighter Group, temporarily attached to the 9th Air Force but operating in direct support of the 8th's bombing campaign. Pilots transitioning from P-47s were immediately struck by the Mustang's responsiveness and speed. At 30,000 feet, it could outclimb and outturn most German fighters, and its acceleration in level flight made it nearly impossible to intercept once it gained energy. The introduction of external drop tanks marked a turning point in air strategy. Allied engineers had experimented with disposable tanks made of metal, paper, and even resin-impregnated fiber to conserve aluminum. These tanks could be jettisoned once emptied, allowing the Mustang to retain its agility during combat. With them, the P-51 could escort B-17 and B-24 formations from bases in England all the way to targets in central Germany, Berlin, Leipzig, and even the distant synthetic fuel plants at Merseburg and Paulitz. For the first time, American bombers were no longer alone beyond the reach of friendly fighters. In operational practice, the process of integration between bomber and escort units evolved rapidly. Early in the campaign, Mustang groups were tasked with close escort, flying in tight formation with the bombers. As experience grew, tactics shifted toward free sweep operations, where fighters roamed ahead and above the bomber stream to intercept German interceptors before they could attack. This new flexibility turned the Mustang into both a shield and a sword. It could protect the bombers while also hunting the enemy on his own terms. Behind these strategic achievements lay an enormous logistical enterprise. Supplying the Mustangs with fuel, ammunition, and spare engines required an intricate transatlantic network. Crated aircraft traveled by ship to Liverpool, then by rail to assembly depots across England. Each plane was flight-tested again before being assigned to combat groups scattered across East Anglia. Maintenance crews learned to service the Packard Merlin under harsh winter conditions, often working outdoors in freezing rain and wind, their tools coated in oil and frost. By late 1943, squadrons of P-51B and P-51C Mustangs were operational across Britain. Their polished metal wings caught the pale winter sun as they rose in tight formation over the Channel. The pilots who flew them soon discovered a new kind of confidence. For the first time, they could stay with the bombers all the way to the target and bring them safely home. The Mustang's arrival did not end the danger of daylight bombing, but it transformed its meaning. No longer a gamble of attrition, it became a coordinated campaign backed by air superiority. The long-awaited escort fighter had arrived, and with it, the balance of power in the skies over Europe began to shift irreversibly in favor of the Allies. When the first P-51B and P-51C Mustangs entered combat service in Europe in late 1943, few could have predicted how quickly they would alter the balance of power in the air. The 354th Fighter Group, the first operational Mustang unit, began flying missions from bases in England in December of that year. Initially attached to the 9th Air Force, it soon operated in direct support of the 8th Air Force's strategic bombing campaign. At first, the aircraft were used cautiously, their capabilities still unfamiliar to both pilots and planners. But within weeks, their performance left no doubt. The Merlin-powered Mustang was unlike any fighter the Allies had ever fielded. The timing of its arrival could not have been more critical. During the winter of 1943 to 1944, the 8th Air Force was still recovering from devastating losses suffered in raids against Regensburg, Schweinfurt, and Bremen. Until then, American bombers had flown only as far as the limits of their escorts allowed, leaving them unprotected over central Germany. The introduction of the Mustang changed that equation overnight. With external tanks, it could accompany bomber formations for the entire mission, across the North Sea, over the industrial heart of the Reich, and back to their bases in East Anglia. The Mustang's first major test came in early 1944 during a series of deep penetration raids that marked the beginning of what the Allies called Big Week, Operation Argument. Between the 20th and the 25th of February 1944, thousands of bombers struck aircraft factories, engine plants, and supply depots across Germany in an attempt to destroy the Luftwaffe's capacity to resist the coming invasion of Western Europe. The newly arrived Mustangs flew continuous escort throughout these missions. They not only defended the bomber streams but actively hunted down German interceptors. For the first time, American fighters pursued the enemy beyond the target area, attacking airfields, trains, and assembly zones on the return route. The Luftwaffe, which had previously dictated when and where to engage, now found itself under siege even above its own territory. The effectiveness of the Mustang was demonstrated with unmistakable clarity on March 6, 1944, during the first major daylight raid on Berlin. Nearly 700 bombers from the 8th Air Force took off under the protection of more than 800 fighters, including over 100 Mustangs. 2 days later, on March 8, Mustangs escorted bombers directly over the German capital itself, engaging enemy fighters in the skies above the city. The sight of silver American bombers and their sleek escorts passing unchallenged over Berlin marked a turning point in the air war. Though the losses were still heavy, over 60 bombers and 10 fighters failed to return. The Luftwaffe's defensive formations were shattered. For the first time, the Germans realized that their homeland was no longer beyond the reach of sustained daylight attacks. In the months that followed, Mustang squadrons became the spearhead of the Allied air offensive. The 4th, 357th, and 352nd Fighter Groups, all equipped with the P-51, achieved kill ratios that had previously seemed impossible. Veteran Luftwaffe units, once dominant over Europe, were steadily depleted by relentless encounters with the new escorts. The Mustang's high speed and maneuverability at altitude allowed it to dictate the terms of engagement. American pilots could now climb to intercept, dive to attack, and break away with superior energy retention. Even Germany's top aces found themselves forced into defensive tactics. Beyond the tactical victories, the psychological impact of the Mustang was immense. For bomber crews, it meant the difference between dread and determination. They no longer faced the long, silent stretch over Germany knowing that their escorts had turned back. Now, the sight of twin drop tanks and the distinctive profile of the Mustang flying alongside gave them confidence. For the Luftwaffe, it was the opposite. The once safe corridors between their bases and assembly areas became killing zones. Mustang pilots roamed the skies, strafing airfields, locomotives, and supply convoys, wearing down the infrastructure of German air defense. By the summer of 1944, the cumulative effect of these operations was devastating. The Luftwaffe's experienced pilots were being lost faster than they could be replaced, its aircraft production crippled by the very bombing campaign the Mustangs protected. During the Normandy invasion in June, the P-51 had already secured complete air superiority over France. German fighters rarely appeared in numbers large enough to threaten the invasion armada. The Mustang's combat debut thus marked more than the arrival of a new aircraft. It signified the beginning of Allied dominance in the European sky. Its presence forced the Luftwaffe into retreat, both strategically and psychologically. The open skies that had once belonged to Germany were now ruled by an aircraft that combined speed, range, and firepower with a precision previously unimaginable. Every mission flown over Europe after March 1944 carried the imprint of this transformation. The Mustang had not only changed the course of the air war, it had redefined what air power itself could accomplish. By the end of 1944, the North American P-51 Mustang had become far more than a successful fighter. It had become the defining instrument of Allied air superiority. Within a year of its introduction to combat, the aircraft had reshaped every aspect of the air war over Europe. The transformation was so complete that by December, almost every fighter group of the U.S. 8th Air Force had converted to the Mustang. The P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning, once the mainstays of the Escort mission, were increasingly reassigned to ground attack roles. The Mustang had done what no other aircraft could. It gave the Allies continuous, high-altitude control of the skies from the English Channel to the borders of Poland. The shift in air power was not simply numerical but strategic. With the Mustang's extended range and efficiency, the 8th Air Force could now conduct deep penetration raids into the industrial heart of Germany with minimal restrictions. Targets once considered too far or too risky, synthetic oil plants in central Germany, ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, and aircraft assembly lines at Augsburg, became regular objectives. The Luftwaffe's defensive grid, built around regional fighter bases and radar coordination, began to collapse. German interceptors could no longer concentrate overwhelming numbers at predictable choke points, because the Mustangs were already waiting for them. Every attempt at interception risked turning into an ambush. As Mustang numbers grew, their mission expanded from escorting bombers to actively dismantling the enemy's air force. Pilots were authorized to pursue German fighters beyond the bomber stream, to strafe airfields, and to destroy aircraft on the ground. This offensive doctrine, made possible by the Mustang's range and speed, accelerated the destruction of the Luftwaffe. By mid-1944, the once formidable German air defense network was being dismantled piece by piece. Experienced pilots were dying faster than replacements could be trained, and new aircraft often sat idle for lack of fuel or safe runways. The skies that had once favored German interceptors now belonged entirely to the Allies. The psychological effect of this dominance rippled through the entire theater of operations. For bomber crews, the sight of Mustangs weaving above their formations was a symbol of protection and inevitability. It meant that the mission, however dangerous, would not be fought alone. For German civilians, the opposite was true. The droning of bomber engines overhead now came with the piercing roar of Allied fighters, a reminder that no city, no matter how deep inside the Reich, was beyond reach. By the autumn of 1944, Allied bombers flew to Berlin, Leipzig, and Munich almost daily, and the Luftwaffe could do little more than harass them. The last reserves of German fighter wings were committed and destroyed in the desperate air battles over the Ruhr and the Ardennes. The Mustang's influence extended beyond Europe. As the war in the Pacific approached its final phase, the aircraft was chosen to perform another unprecedented task: long-range escort of B-29 Super Fortress bombers striking Japan. Following the capture of Iwo Jima in March 1945, U.S. Army Air Forces engineers built airstrips specifically to house Mustang squadrons. From this small volcanic island, the P-51D, the latest and most refined variant, could accompany B-29 raids across the 1,500 kilometers of ocean to Tokyo and back. On April 7, 1945, Mustangs flew their first very long-range escort mission over Japan, marking the first time in history that fighters had accompanied bombers all the way to the enemy's capital in a transoceanic operation. The technical and strategic achievement of these missions was enormous. The Mustangs not only defended the bombers but also engaged Japanese interceptors over their own homeland, destroying hundreds of aircraft in the final months of the war. The psychological message was unmistakable: American air power could now strike anywhere, protected from takeoff to landing. The same aircraft that had chased German fighters over Berlin was now guarding bombers over Tokyo. It was a continuity of dominance that no nation had ever achieved before. By the time the war ended in 1945, more than 15,000 Mustangs had been produced, and they served with air forces from Britain to Australia. The aircraft's reputation transcended its specifications. It was admired for its balance, fast yet stable, powerful yet efficient, and for its ability to adapt to every theater of war. It escorted bombers, fought interceptors, strafed trains, and destroyed supply columns. Its presence symbolized not only technological mastery but also the industrial cooperation of the Allies, an American airframe powered by a British engine, manufactured on an industrial scale by workers on 2 continents. In the closing months of the war, the Mustang became the visible proof that the Allies had achieved complete control of the air. From London to the Pacific, from Normandy's beaches to Japan's volcanic islands, the same sleek silhouette could be seen slicing through the sky. It was not merely a fighter, it was a declaration that the balance of power in the modern world now rested with those who could command the heavens. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the Mustang did not fade into the background of history. Instead, it entered a second life, one that extended far beyond the war that had defined it. The aircraft that had escorted bombers to Berlin and Tokyo continued to fly in skies around the world for decades, becoming a symbol of balance between performance, reliability, and beauty in design. Its legacy rested not only on its wartime achievements, but on the clarity of its engineering philosophy, simplicity married to efficiency, elegance joined with strength. As the United States demobilized its massive wartime air forces, thousands of surplus P-51s were stored, sold, or transferred to Allied nations. By 1946, Mustangs served in more than 30 air forces, from Britain and Canada to Sweden, Australia, and Israel. Nations emerging from occupation or rebuilding their defenses saw in the P-51 an aircraft that combined affordability with unmatched performance. In Britain, the Royal Air Force continued to operate the Mustang under the designation Mustang IV until the introduction of jet aircraft in the early 1950s. In Latin America, countries such as the Dominican Republic, Guatemala, and El Salvador flew the type well into the 1970s. The aircraft's service record after 1945 was as varied as it was extensive. During the Korean War, the P-51, by then redesignated F-51 under the new U.S. Air Force system, returned to combat once again. In the early months of the conflict, before jet bases were established, the Mustang became the backbone of United Nations ground attack operations. Its long range and ability to operate from rough airstrips made it ideal for close air support and reconnaissance missions across the Korean peninsula. Pilots who had once fought over Europe now found themselves flying against new enemies in a new kind of war. Despite facing the first generation of jet fighters, the Mustang proved its worth in low-level strike missions and earned respect for its ruggedness and endurance. The end of the Korean War marked the final chapter of the Mustang's combat career with the United States, but its influence on aviation design continued to echo. Edgar Schmid, the aircraft's chief designer, went on to develop the F-86 Sabre, a jet fighter that inherited many of the aerodynamic principles first tested on the Mustang. The lessons learned from the P-51's laminar flow wing, cooling system, and control harmony informed a generation of engineers who would go on to shape the jet age. The transition from piston engines to jets did not erase the Mustang's importance, it bridged the gap between two eras of flight. In the years that followed, the Mustang became both a veteran and a symbol. Many surviving aircraft were sold to private owners or converted into racing planes. At air shows across the United States, its unmistakable silhouette and the deep, throaty growl of its Packard Merlin engine became the sound of nostalgia. Pilots described it as an aircraft that seemed alive, responsive, graceful, and perfectly balanced. To historians, it represented the peak of piston engine fighter design, the point at which mechanical performance and human control achieved harmony before the coming of supersonic flight. Edgar Schmid himself remained modest about his role in creating the aircraft that had changed the course of the war. He often credited his design team and the collaborative spirit between North American aviation, the British engineers at Rolls-Royce, and the thousands of factory workers who turned blueprints into reality. For Schmid, the Mustang was not a monument to individual genius but to collective problem-solving under the pressure of necessity. His conviction that form must serve function guided his entire career and became a principle in modern aeronautical engineering. Over time, the Mustang evolved from a tool of war into a symbol of partnership. It embodied the unity of effort between nations that had once fought for survival. The British Merlin engine and the American airframe together represented the strength of shared innovation. In museums and memorials, from Dayton to Duxford, restored Mustangs stood as reminders of what engineering cooperation could achieve. The aircraft's clean lines and purposeful design continued to inspire designers and aviators alike. By the end of the 20th century, more than 50 years after its first flight, dozens of Mustangs still took to the air, maintained by collectors, restored with painstaking care, and flown in commemoration of the generation that had built them. Their presence in the skies reminded those who watched that the story of the Mustang was not only about technology but about endurance, creativity, and the human desire to master the impossible. The P-51's legacy was measured not only in victories or production numbers but in its enduring influence on how aircraft were conceived. It proved that excellence emerged when design transcended nationality, when innovation served purpose, and when collaboration became the foundation of progress. The Mustang's wings had carried the hopes of a world at war, and long after peace returned, they continued to carry the memory of what humanity could achieve when it built not merely to destroy, but to endure. The story of the Mustang was, at its heart, the story of cooperation. It was not born from a single mind or a single nation but from the convergence of many engineers, pilots, factories, and governments that learned to trust one another in the most destructive war humanity had ever known. The P-51's creation stood as proof that progress in war, as in peace, required humility as much as innovation. Its wings carried not only the physical weight of fuel and metal but also the invisible weight of shared human effort, the belief that through reason and design, chaos could be tamed. Unlike many wartime inventions that emerged from secrecy or rivalry, the Mustang was built in the open flow of Allied collaboration. A British commission had requested it, an American company had designed it, and a German-born engineer had shaped its form. Later, a British test pilot recognized its potential, and American factories multiplied it by the thousands. The aircraft's very structure embodied the ideal that no single country possessed a monopoly on genius. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, born in Derby and refined in Detroit by Packard, was mated to a fuselage conceived in California. Every bolt, every rivet, and every curve told the story of an alliance that worked not only in strategy but in imagination. The Mustang's triumph lay not just in its speed or range, but in what it represented about the human capacity to adapt. War had forced nations to overcome pride and bureaucracy in order to survive. In that process, engineers became diplomats of necessity. They traded ideas instead of rhetoric, solutions instead of slogans. The Mustang became the physical embodiment of this quiet diplomacy, a machine built by people who refused to accept that perfection could only come from one flag or one factory. When it flew across occupied Europe, guiding bomber formations through flak and fire, it was more than an instrument of destruction. It was a messenger of what collective intelligence could achieve. The aircraft that once guarded the skies of London now protected the same ideals that had inspired its creation: freedom of thought, of design, of cooperation. For the aircrews who saw its shadow alongside their own, the Mustang became a symbol of endurance, proof that no mission was truly solitary. It accompanied them into the darkest regions of the sky and brought them home again. In philosophical terms, the Mustang's existence challenged one of the oldest assumptions about war, that invention must come from desperation alone. Here was an aircraft that emerged not from chaos but from discipline, from a methodical, almost peaceful dialogue between engineers who were thousands of miles apart. Its success suggested that even amid destruction, humanity's creative impulse could find order. The same intelligence that built engines and wings was capable of building bridges between nations. Edgar Schmid, the man most closely associated with the Mustang's design, often said that he never saw himself as its sole creator. His modesty reflected the essence of the machine itself. The Mustang was not a monument to personal ambition, it was a demonstration of shared purpose. Its beauty came from clarity of thought, its strength from the unity of its parts. Every country that contributed to it left a trace of itself in its form, a line, a sound, a rhythm. After the war, as new generations of jet aircraft took to the sky, the Mustang remained a reminder that innovation was not simply the product of competition but of connection. It stood at the intersection of two truths: that human ingenuity thrives in freedom, and that freedom survives only when it is defended together. When it escorted bombers to Berlin and later to Tokyo, the Mustang symbolized not conquest but continuity, the idea that cooperation could outlast conflict. In the end, the P-51 was not merely an airplane, it was a statement about civilization itself. It demonstrated that the greatest victories of the modern age did not belong to those who built higher walls or stronger weapons, but to those who built bridges, intellectual, industrial, and moral. The Mustang's engine may have roared with the sound of war, but its legacy spoke of something far more enduring: that progress, at its purest, is the art of recognizing brilliance wherever it is found and giving it the freedom to fly.